So welcome everyone to another session of the Regenerative Finance Lab. And we are probably going to rename this space after the learning journey is over. We talked about that a little bit in the previous session, how we are evolving the structures of the design school overall and reintegrating some of the pieces. And one of the problems with this space is that this is probably the most valuable and active space for seeing the practice of Earth regeneration. Maybe this space combined with the inner space, or the two spaces in the design school that really get into the practice in the deepest ways. And very few people come here because of the word finance. And so they think we're just talking about money. They don't know anything about money and they don't come to this space. So for that reason and for other changes, we're probably going to rename this space. But it's actually very appropriately named today, because today we're going to talk about what I might just call the financial infrastructure for regenerating the earth is what we're going to talk about today. And this is not theoretical. This is the financial infrastructure that we have already built, as well as the next steps in our process of building it out. And some of you will see things that are familiar in the presentation that I'll give today. And for some of you, it might all be new. But I think it's really important to show with clarity how the structures are set up. And also to just name that part of the name change that we're doing is I found that there is a certain set of people that I won't name who are very actively and have been very actively for more than half a decade trying to systematically destroy my reputation out in the world. And anytime they see me talking about money, they do what they can to suppress my presence in social media and to rally more people against what we're doing. In part because what we're doing is actually working, and those people want money to go to themselves. It's ego games of false profits. And so for various reasons, including that one, we're going to find ourselves talking about money less in the public sphere to activate less of that immune system response of the old and dying system. And when I refer to those people, those are regenerative leaders in the regenerative movement. And so those are not enemies of the movement. They are destroyers of the movement as they're building fiefdoms. And so the complexity of this work is that we have to somehow bypass the pathologies of leadership by getting into the clarity of storytelling around what actually works and strategies for what actually works to be what spreads, rather than egos and personalities. So I have been unfortunately framed as a regenerative leader, so then it's not too hard to set me up and take me down. Because once you frame an entire movement as being about its leaders, you've just erased, well over 99% of the people involved. And what we actually need to do is showcase the people doing the work. And so what we're going to see today is an infrastructure for flowing resources to the people on the ground doing the work. It's an infrastructure, like I said, that's already been built. It's been running, and it is now expanding and growing and diversifying. So you can start to see various scales at which it's playing out. And it's meant to be a planetary scale infrastructure, meaning it's meant to be an infrastructure that maps itself to the multi-level nature of reality and how the planet is organized in a fractal fashion. So you'll see that today as well. So with no further ado, I'd like to go into the presentation part of the discussion today. Probably take about 25 minutes, and then we'll have plenty of time, as we always have, plenty of time for discussion afterwards. And what I'm going to do is just mute everyone so there's no accidental background noise during the presentation part, and then I'll jump right in. And maybe before I start, I'll just say, the vision that I'm going to share today, I'm going to be completely honest with you, I don't actually believe it's going to happen. We've been naming this vision. The first time I named it was in April of 2020, 5 years ago, more than 5 years ago. And it has been such a difficult battle to make any of it happen. The funders do not show up. The funders still look for financial returns and ego positioning rather than the fact the biosphere is unraveling. And there are various other things happening out in the world. So I'm not going to share this vision telling you, wow, I'm amazing, I can totally do this, and we got it. I'm going to tell you this is a real actionable framework that we have pulled teeth and have blood, sweat, and tears to make it happen to get to where we are today. And it's working. And that is no guarantee that any more funding will flow into it whatsoever, because of the weird dynamics of money and power in a collapsing world. And so I'm just going to give that full disclosure, because this is not a Silicon Valley tech pitch. This is real grassroots organizer talk about what we're doing to try and make this thing happen. And so several of you have been in the blood, sweat, and tears with me, and we have scars to prove it. So I'm just saying this is the real work. And so you're going to see something that might look visionary, but it's actually, I would call it the minimum viable product. I say we need more than what I'm going to show you today. And if we could get any semblance of it to actually propagate, then we will have succeeded to a really high bar. So, all right, with that said, let me start the presentation. And so, here we go. So the title of today's talk is Beginning to Structure the Earth Regeneration Trust. And the Earth Regeneration Trust is the name that we've given to the nonprofit that we're in the process of setting up. So I'll talk a little bit about the nonprofit organization that we're setting up to manage this. We already have a number of nonprofit organizations set up in various countries doing various things, but our key foundational fiscal sponsor in the United States is the wrong legal structure. And so it's set up as a nonprofit foundation, and we need a nonprofit charitable organization. And so we're setting up a different legal structure. But while that particular process is happening, we've already set up about half a dozen other organizations, and we have another one in Barichara that we're setting up right now. So just saying, this is definitely not a dream pitch of something we might do. It's something that we're adding the next tools into the toolkit. But today I want to talk about the way we're structuring it, and the way the structuring has emerged throughout the last 4 or 5 years, and then how you can see it's coming in the next year. I'll give a projection through the end of 2026. And so I want to start with a little timeline. So in around beginning of 2020, it's January 1st, 2020, when I launched Earth Regenerators as a discussion group for the unpublished manuscript of my book, The Design Pathway. We gathered what eventually became almost 5,000 members. We led webinars and learning journeys and all kinds of distributed leadership, and mobilized crowdfunding and bought land and started regenerative processes and moved money to people and had an Earth Regenerators Fund, and a lot of things happened between 2020 and 2023. But when we got to the point of late 2020, early 2021, we began developing a framework of bioregional regeneration with a living laboratory in Barichara, Colombia, which has advanced substantially since then. And then in March of 2023, we transitioned from the Earth Regenerators Network to the Design School for Regenerating Earth, and we launched the Design School on March 1st of 2023. In late January, early February of 2024, in collaboration with the Legacy Project, we hosted an in-person online mixed event for 6 days called the 7th Generation Bioregional Earth Summit. And we officially launched Bioregional Earth at that time. About 7,000 people attended live in that summit during that time. And then in the beginning of this year, or really in September, October of 2024, and into this year, we began structuring the planetary scaling of our work. So this is a multi-year process. And the key thing to note is that what is written into my book, The Design Pathway for Regenerating Earth, is what we're living out on this timeline. And that we've already mobilized more than $2 million into this system, and we have more money coming, and we already have $1.6 million guaranteed coming in the next 18 months, in addition to what we have now as it's starting to flow into these systems. So this is very much in process. And the planetary network of bioregions that we've been building through our bioregional activation tours, through our learning journey and how to organize your bioregion, and through many other parallel activities, working with many different partners, we're living all of this out. Now, how do we structure something as complex as this? See, first we need to articulate what are we structuring it for? And so our vision is to see the Earth fully regenerated And we want to fully regenerate it through deep patterns of healing in local landscapes across the planet, which is why we imagine a network of place-based efforts. So each different bioregion of the planet self-organizes and engages in its own regeneration. How do they do that? They organize bioregional learning ecosystems and frameworks for large-scale regeneration. This is what we explore in our learning journeys. And I've actually given about 250 webinars since 2020 on these topics. There's a huge amount of learning that has been well documented. And at the core of it all has been a real-world prototype in Barichara, where we've been showing what we're doing and then taking what we're learning by doing it and sharing it with others. And now we're taking that prototype into various different levels through the structuring of this financial system. And so our funding ecosystem, you can think of it as having 3 basic levels, which is very much oversimplified, but this will give you a sense of how it starts to work. First, we have a local laboratory, which is 500,000 hectare regenerative work in Barichara through the Barichara Regeneration Fund. The Barichara Regeneration Fund was launched on December 3rd of 2020. So we're approaching 5 years that it's existed. This is a funding ecosystem at the bioregional scale with diverse local actors and financial flows. We set up a territorial foundation. We have created a regenerative school for children. We have created an innovation hub for regenerative economies. We've created a collective for syntropic agroforestry. A bunch of stuff has happened and is continuing to happen in Barichara. And with all of the structure of this framework of bioregional regeneration in Barichara, we were able to set up the Northern Andes Regeneration Fund last year. And now we have 7 Colombian regions where there is either an existing and legally constituted territorial foundation, or there's a local team that's in the process of legally constituting a territorial foundation. And in these 7 territories, we're taking the regenerative frameworks of the territorial foundation in Barichara and adapting it to the 6 other territories and mobilizing financial resources into the tapestries of local processes, into the portfolios of projects and the strategic narratives of each of the 7 territories and of the Northern Andes as a whole. And I'll explain more how that works in a moment. And then we have the 3rd level, which is the Earth Regeneration Fund, which is the planetary network. And last year, in September and October, we allocated $25,000 each to 5 different bioregions. So we passed money to the Greater Tikaranto bioregion in Southern Ontario, to the Cascadia bioregion in the Pacific Northwest of North America, to the Ogallala High Plains bioregional context of the middle part of the North American continent, to the forests of the Northeast in the northeastern part of Turtle Island, and then also to the Northern Andes in Barichara, Colombia. So in these 5 different regions, we invested funding in helping to create bioregional funding ecosystems. So you can see there are these 3 different major levels. A bioregional prototype that receives heavy investment to be out front in developing the frameworks and tools and learnings, and then replicating them across 6 other territories in the Northern Andes. And then through our online platform in the design school, we have been building out a planetary framework of a planetary network of bioregions and piloting funding ecosystems with local leadership in multiple landscape systems simultaneously. So all of this has been happening throughout the last few years and really accelerating in the last 12 to 18 months. The Earth Regeneration Fund itself, as I mentioned, actually allocated $275,000 US in 2024, $125,000 through the design school to 5 places, and then $125,000 into the launch of the Northern Andes Regeneration Fund. And so between roughly August of last year and now, that $275,000 has been allocated. Nearly all of it has been spent. It has flowed into local regenerative processes in a framework that matches the prophecy of the eagle and the condor, creating learning exchanges between North, Central, and South America, while anchoring to the Northern and Southern Hemisphere areas through work in North America and work in Colombia initially. And so the Earth Regeneration Fund is alive and well. It's already allocated substantial funding in its first year and more funding in its second year, which we'll talk about in a moment. And the way that we structure all of this can be seen in the relationship between the Northern Andes Fund and Barichara. So the Northern Andes Regeneration Fund is a collaboration between 7 different territories. And I'll show you where those 7 territories are in a couple of slides. But there are 7 different territories. In each territory, a territorial foundation has been set up, and all 7 of them have adopted the same framework for regeneration through the Northern Andes Regeneration Fund. And that framework is that there are 4 thematic areas. Those 4 thematic areas help to determine how they understand regeneration in their own territories. And those thematic frameworks were developed in Barichara and then replicated to the other territories. And in each thematic area, a community fund is set up. So just do the math. 4 thematic areas, 7 territorial foundations, 7 times 4 is 28. So this means we're creating 28 community funds. So just as an example, the first thematic area is regenerative education. So that means a regenerative education fund has been set up in each of the 7 territories for a total of 7 regenerative education funds with shared frameworks across the 7 territories managed through the Northern Andes Fund. And then the same for the 3 other thematic areas to have a total of 28 funds divided into 4 thematic categories spread across 7 territories. And each community fund is a tapestry of local initiatives. So again, if you're thinking of regenerative education, there might be a permaculture center. There might be a place that teaches recycling. There might be a regenerative school for children. Whatever those local processes are, they are gathered together through the convening of the territorial foundation to create a community fund in that thematic area and then organize a portfolio, participatory budgeting processes, and collaborative frameworks for allocating funds so that there is territorial governance and funding organized within the thematic areas and replicated across all 7 territories. To see how this works for the Northern Andes Fund, it helps to go back and look at how Fundación Barichara Regenerativa was set up, because this is the model that's replicated across the 7 territories. So for starters, we have 4 thematic areas. They are regenerative education, regenerative economy, regeneration of ecosystems or ecosystem restoration, and regenerative culture and territorial healing. So in each of these thematic areas, a community fund has been set up, and that community fund has been set up by mapping local processes that are relevant to that thematic area, convening the people that are managing and holding those processes, creating frameworks of collaboration between them, and then mobilizing resources to them and among them, which is all of that is the work of the Territorial Foundation. So this creates a pattern that spreads to the other territories. And so what you can see is that we have a framework that is shared across 7 territorial foundations for understanding what regeneration is, how it's tracked, what its priorities are, and they are developed by local actors and local processes in each territory. This enables us to have shared monitoring, reporting, and evaluation across a network of territories, which de-risks large-scale investment. And so this sets up a structure that could receive a much larger amount of money. I could easily see in 2 years, $50 million to $100 million moving into the Northern Andes Fund because of the way that this multi-scale structure is set up, with reporting and monitoring and evaluation shared across the 7 territories as a unified framework of a portfolio of portfolios. Because each thematic area is a portfolio of projects, but there are 4, and those 4 portfolios create a territorial portfolio for each of the 7 territories, and then the 7 territories creates 7 portfolios of territorial portfolios, which is the portfolio of investment opportunities for regenerating the Northern Andes. And now you can start to see the power of this framework. And so when you think of how these 2 are related, what we're doing in Barichara, and that's replicating up to the Northern Andes level with the different thematic areas, now look at where the 7 territories are. These are the 7 territories that either already have legally constituted a territorial foundation or are very close to doing so. And what you see is that it's a pretty good starting point to cover the entire Northern Andes. So even though we'll eventually end up going down into Ecuador, we'll end up having more territories in Colombia. The key organizing pattern is to set up a territorial foundation and then organize the mapping of local processes in the way I just described. This allows us to envision strategies that traverse or that cross all the territories in the same thematic focus. So as an example, we might decide to create a framework for regenerative tourism that is a shared framework across 7 territories. Or we might create a shared framework for watershed restoration that is replicated across all 7 territories, which creates a rationale for an investor to invest in piloting a project in one territory so that it can be replicated in the 6 others. And so this envisioning of strategies that traverse all the territories in the same thematic focus area is highly generative and very powerful for attracting strategic investment. The other thing is that as we gather these portfolios of local processes, we can create very powerful narratives. And those narratives can mobilize resources that we wouldn't be able to access otherwise. So if we're telling a story about regenerating the sacred headwaters of the Amazon, we have the major watersheds of Florencia and Putumayo, which are in the Amazon basin. But if we're going to talk about something like preserving of biodiversity, well, I got to say, there's a lot of biodiversity in Antioquia, where Medellin is, and in the area where El Tambo is, as well as in Florencia and Putumayo. So we can create a different framework that gathers several of the territories in a cluster around the thinking of biodiversity, and so on for other thematic areas. And this is how we envision the Northern Andes Fund mobilizing resources for regeneration across the Northern Andes as a whole. So what's interesting about this is we're developing the same framework in another place, which is the same framework I just said that Barichara is a model replicated in 6 other territories in Colombia. Well, we're also collaborating with the Legacy Project in the Greater Toronto Bioregion, or the GTB, where they can replicate out to the Great Lakes. And so by working with Brian and Susan of the Legacy Project, we are creating a framework for parallel and diverse strategic investment to mobilize resources to the Northern Andes and to the Great Lakes, anchoring it to the concrete demonstration of success in what we're doing in Barichara and in what they're doing in the GTB. And so we're developing a framework for replicating what we're doing in the Northern Andes between North and South America through the Earth Regeneration Fund. And so we're already, the GTB has structured a portfolio of projects with the 4 thematic areas that we developed in Barichara. They've adapted them to their context, as every territory or bioregion should do. And we're now jointly approaching strategic investors around creating a collaborative fund for systems transformation using the GTB and the Northern Andes as pilot projects. But then we can leverage all of this infrastructure and all of this organizing of the Northern Andes Fund to support those fundraising efforts, and then help move funding into the Great Lakes and not just into the Northern Andes. And now you start to see the planetary significance of what we're doing. Now at a much smaller scale, at the scale of we've already allocated something like $20,000 or $25,000, we introduced the Bioregional Activation Funding Pool and beginning of March of this year, just before our current learning journey, where we said we were taking all of your membership dues, because members of the design school pay $5 a month, or they could pay at a higher level if they want to. We've pooled all of that money, and just during the time of the current learning journey, we have flowed small amounts of funding into 5 on-the-ground projects. People that are doing design immersions or pilot projects of bioregional regeneration. In this way, we're using the pooling of membership dues in the design school to provide seed funding to early stage organizing. So the participants in our learning journey, they're learning about bioregional organizing, but those who actually practice can come and request funding. And so far, we've allocated funding to 5 projects. Just in the last few days, we've approved 2 more, and we have 4 additional places where people have requested funding, where we're in conversations about allocating design school membership dues to support even more design immersions. So here you can see at the very beginning of the process, we can help fund a local event or a local immersion for a few days to help people begin the bioregional organizing as we're strengthening the planetary network of bioregions through the work of the design school. So this is another really key element. This is an on-ramp into the system for the beginners, the ones who are just getting started in the process. So we've already supported 5 initiatives and have 6 more requesting support now. And the capacities are growing simply by growing our number of members in the design school. We have more monthly revenue to allocate to this Bioregional Activation Funding Pool through the design school membership dues. And so now you can start to see all of the structures together. The Earth Regeneration Trust has a local laboratory in Barichara, has its first regional network in the Northern Andes. It has a planetary network through the Earth Regeneration Fund, and it's got a Bioregional Activation Funding Pool that partners with the planetary network of bioregions associated with the design school so that we can replicate this out to the planetary scale in earnest across multiple continents. And so we have all this structure and all of this is in place. So what's our plan from now through basically the end of 2026? Well, there are a couple of key things we need to do. One is the Earth Regeneration Trust is just a name. So we need to create our new US 501c3 nonprofit as a charitable organization, because that's something that we can do easily with the limited resources that we have now, so that we can move funding in a different way than we're currently doing. And then we have in the Northern Andes Fund, there are 2 key things we need to do. One is I am going to visit all 7 of the territories in the next few months to assist them in deepening their understanding of bioregionalism and regeneration, and to help them to strengthen their portfolios of local processes and to cultivate shared narratives. So I'm a member of the governing group of the Northern Andes Fund. I'm one of its founders, and my role in the next few months is to help the territories with site visits, to strengthen their portfolios, to develop their capacity to receive more capital flow, and to gather narratives with them to tell their stories out to the world. And this will be the work that'll probably take me through the end of this year. And then in Barichara, we actually need to raise some more funding for our learning ecosystem, which I'll talk more about that in a moment. And we need to strengthen territorial governance with the financial resources that we have. And we're doing that through watershed governance models, through geospatial mapping and other things that we've talked about in a previous Regenerative Finance Lab. About 2 months ago, I gave a webinar about the strategic budget of Barichara Regenerativa. But in the next year, we're going to implement a framework of territorial governance that's already in process. And then through the design school and this planetary network of bioregions, we're going to continue living into the design pathway as individuals, as local teams, as learning support systems. We're going to keep catalyzing more bioregional organizing through the online learning exchanges and the in-person gatherings and our Bioregional Activation Funding Pool. And we're going to support learning exchanges as we have done as a primary focus of the design school since its beginning. And so this is just going to continue to happen with some restructuring of the design school that starts in October, but that's going to carry us into the next year. And so all of these are happening in parallel. And this relates to something I talked about at the end of last year and the beginning of this year, the narrative strategy for the Earth Regeneration Fund, which now we're calling the Earth Regeneration Trust. What is our narrative strategy? In its essence, and I've said this multiple times before, is that as the old system breaks down, we weave a pattern of place-based efforts. So the place-based efforts are not alone. They come together and engage in exchanges. We flow funding to bioregional teams through the various mechanisms we've talked about here. And then we build coherence across the network of bioregions through storytelling and through learning exchanges, supported by the scaffolding of the design school and this funding ecosystem. And then we form a tapestry of bioregions to regenerate the Earth, which is ongoing indefinitely into the future. And so we've been doing that. Our immediate needs in the next few months is we need to attract systems level impact investors and philanthropists, because we have a current operational budget that we need to do some fundraising to complete, and we want to grow our capacities to mobilize much larger funding in the future. And so we've already secured $750,000 for the next year. And that is through three places: $150,000 that came to Barichara Regenerativa, $300,000 that's come to the design school, and $300,000 that's come to the Northern Andes Fund, so that we can create this really tight coupling of investment into the Northern Andes Fund's its structures and capacities. But we still need to raise another $300,000 to complete our operational budget, and really emphasizing the communications and learning ecosystem in Barichara. I have another slide deck that's part of a pitch deck that gives a detailed line item budget for where that $300,000 number comes from. But we literally have a line item budget with about 10 different teams, which I play a management role on all of them. It's a little crazy. And within those teams, there are team members who we already know who they are. We're already funding them to do work. And just to continue the work we're doing, we need to raise an additional $300,000 to get us through the end of 2026. So our focus in 2026, if you want to think of it in terms of strategic outcomes, is we want to replicate the systems of monitoring and dispersal that we have in Barichara. We want to replicate that across all 7 regions of Colombia through the Northern Andes Fund. So that's that work of visiting the territories and strengthening their portfolios and setting up a monitoring system through the Northern Andes Fund. And then we want to establish an integrated land system plan for Barichara's work, which is setting up that framework for territorial governance and integrating it with the learning ecosystem that we've been building since late 2020 and early 2021, which is now advancing to a very mature place. And then we want to set up administrative structures through the creation of a new organization and through monitoring and reporting frameworks, so that we can receive much larger capital flows into the network of bioregions at the planetary scale. So if you happen to be in a position to help us out with this, or if you'd like to put us in contact with potential strategic investors and philanthropists, here's a way you can do it. There's a QR code right there if you want to donate. Just know that we're in action and we're starting to look for those kinds of partnerships. And then, in closing, in this rapid fire tour of the structures of the Earth Regeneration Fund and the Earth Regeneration Trust, our vision is to pool large funding for Earth regeneration and distribute it across the planetary network of bioregions in all the ways I just described. And so that's what I wanted to share with you today. So you could see, like, it just keeps maturing through the practice of what we're doing. And we feel really ready to take this to the next level. I think in the next 6 months, we'll start approaching people about $20 million and $30 million asks, where we can start to really take this to the next level, if we can find investors who actually care about saving humans from extinction and not just about increasing their own ego importance, which is what most rich people in the world today are: immature babies who feel like they need to feel more important and have even more power as the world dies. And we don't care about those people. We're not going to distract ourselves with those people. My litmus test of maturity is if someone has the spiritual awareness that they need to move money into keeping vital species and ecosystems from going extinct. And if they don't have that level of maturity, don't even ask them to talk to me. If they need a financial return and they're already rich, tell them to go home and suck their thumbs. This is a time for the adults. This is a time for the grown-ups. And if any of those potential investors hear me say this now, you know if I'm talking about you or not. And so I want to turn off all of the babies who are rich. And I want to talk to the spiritually devoted, because now is the time and there's no time left. So that's my presentation for you today. And I'd love to open it up now for discussion. So if there are any questions or comments, this would be a good time to raise your hand and we can have a conversation. And like I said at the beginning, I'm not sharing this vision to pitch it because I think that just all of a sudden some billionaire's going to come along and drop $100 million in our lap. I'm just telling you that this is a real system and it's functioning. And every little bit more that we do to demonstrate its effectiveness is going to build its capacity. And that is actually the key work, is demonstrating its effectiveness. And many of you are already doing that in your own work. And we need to elevate that up to the larger scale. Steve, over to you.
Yeah, I want to come back to the disclaimer you added at the beginning of the session, which is this is a coherent, pragmatic, effective plan that can realize impact and truly regenerating Earth, and it's not going to happen. So, can you elaborate on your skepticism and how are we supposed to accept the story you told
Well,
in the light of that disclaimer?
if you've been looking at any of the data about the world ocean right now, you can see the lockstep of 5 or 6 of the roughly 15 Earth systems tipping points are all being crossed simultaneously.
Mm-hmm.
And so the prospect of us having a place to sit calmly and discuss strategy is pretty much entirely gone now. And what we've seen in the world of the wealth hoarders is that they're going into extreme wealth hoarding mode. And so and you can see that with the talk is about the persona of Donald Trump in the United States, which is a distraction. The reality is that there is a cabal of billionaires who have built a technology surveillance state to control what's left of the extraction of the Earth's resources. And they have weaponized propaganda to an extreme degree across all of our communication systems through the manipulation of algorithms. And so the capacity for us to mobilize large resources depends on the stories getting to the right people. And so, just as an example, if I write a post on LinkedIn where I have 18,000 followers and I say anything about funding, it'll get less than 100 impressions because the algorithms will fully suppress it. And if any of those immature egos of the regenerative movement who are out bad talking me behind my back, they will also flag it as harmful content to encourage the algorithms to suppress it even further, which I now have evidence that they've been doing. And so, looking at a weaponized context like that, the only way this is going to happen at this point is if the people who have money, who are looking in their own spiritual path to put it where it needs to go, that they will find their way to it and that it actually won't be promoted out to those people. That the attempts to sell this anywhere are largely nullified by the structure of our communication system. And so I feel like much of what I talked about today, I talked about in April of 2020, and no funding arrived. And we've built this with blood, sweat, and tears ever since. And we've now crossed multiple tipping points between then and now. And so the irreversibility of where we are is very serious, very, very serious. So I want to be sure that this doesn't sound like a utopian pitch. That's why I put that disclaimer at the beginning, is anyone who's not mature enough to hear that and stay in the conversation, who's not able to hold paradox, I'm not interested in talking to. And so my sense is that the paradox is that it may still be highly possible for the very unlikely circumstance that a large amount of money flows into a system like this and is replicated across the world. But it's extremely unlikely statistically with all of the factors that are running against it. And we just need to be completely honest with ourselves about that. Because that's like, if we're going to be social entrepreneurs in this context, sugarcoating it is not going to get us anywhere. And so that's why I just would rather put it front and center and be completely honest about it. Eric, over to you.
Yes, thank you. Yeah, I fully agree. I have been through my own experiences over the last 5 years in terms of fundraising, and the deck is absolutely stacked against you. And that's a reality that cannot be denied. So what you have presented is absolutely excellent at the micro scale. But the connection between the micro and the macro funding system and what supports the macro funding system, that connection is missing. And I mean, it's just how it is. I can relate my own stories of fundraising and within the world of philanthropy, within the world of the large foundations, and so on and so on. And I've come to the same conclusion that you've just expressed very, very eloquently, that you are, we're fighting against thunder. Don't bother to try and live in illusions and try to go that way, because it just ain't going to happen. The opposition is extremely well organized, extremely well funded, and unless whatever you propose is in line with the existing paradigm, the extractive paradigm, you don't bother to go any further. So the real issue is, how do we unlock access to finance? And there's no time today to go through that whole discussion. But if we don't change the story, and the primary story to change is how we value. If we continue, because it doesn't matter where you go, whoever is trying to do regenerative finance and reshape finance and, impact investing and everything else, you still are moving and you are within the guardrails of the existing system. So forget it. So that has to be radically changed. And the core point, the tipping point for making the argument is how we value. How do we value life? And nobody's been able to come up with any argument, any story in terms of how do we value life, as opposed to how do we value all the artificial things that's, surrounding us and is being pressed down our throats as we go. If we don't change the story and how we tell the story credibly, that logical people can act in terms of how we value life, we are backing up the wrong tree. So, and that's another story that we can, pursue in another conversation. But to live in the delusion and the illusion of a well-organized, which what you are doing is absolutely excellent. It is absolutely excellent, and it's the way to go. But we still haven't bridged that gap between micro and macro. But that's a story for another day. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Eric. I think that's a key part of the work, is to develop the spiritual capacities within the conversations, where we can bridge this in some of the structural ways that money does move and it can move. Because the de-risking and the other demonstration and verifying and all those, that part, like, we know how to do that. But people have to recognize the value proposition first. And so yeah, there's a lot to be discussed in there. Just want to mention in the sequence, Kyle had asked if someone could help with a hand raise. He's now fourth in the sequence, but I'll move him in front of Claire because he had asked before, and I saw that in the chat. So we'll go to Stephen and then Kyle and then Claire. So I did glimpse that in the chat. And then over to you, Stephen.
Hey, everyone. Thanks for the very interesting presentation. And I totally agree with everything that's been said about the challenges. I have a question because I'm somewhat new to this group, and I'm curious for one thing, I'm curious what the sources of the funding has been so far, foundations and governments and things like that. But I'm curious more specifically, giving thought to very broad-based fundraising along the lines of Greenpeace or Sierra Club in the U.S., but models where you get millions and millions of people giving small amounts, similar to the subscription fee a month. To what extent have you thought about that? And then something else I've been thinking about, in the U.S. is the possibility of creating a fund, basically a loan fund. To what extent could these investments be loans, very low interest loans, sort of along the lines of the way CDFIs work, where you could create a fund for, I mean, I think of like millions of people who are putting like a fair amount of 401k money into basically the stock market, where you could access a piece of that. And I'm talking about like middle class, upper middle class people who might give a percentage of their retirement money to projects like this, with the idea that they're going to get 2 or 3% returns. And because I think there's an untapped resource there. And anyway, I'm curious what you think of whether you've been giving thought to any of those ideas.
Yeah, I would start by saying any way that there's compounding interest built onto the financial return for the investor is an extractive model. And so that is already excluded by definition. What we need is alternative forms of return. And there are many. So for example, creating educational opportunities for youth creates different kinds of return than just financial return. Or reforestation can create water availability to a community and then health. And so you can get ecological and social health. And then from there, you can make a myriad of observations about other forms of return. But the key issue is about people knowing what kinds of returns are real. Because right now, there are a lot of people hoarding money with the delusion that money is somehow security. But you can't eat paper. You definitely can't eat digital numbers in a digital database. And so, and then they're like doubly or triply not real. Whereas you can eat food from an agroforestry system. And so there's something really important about more people recognizing where real value is, which is related to what Eric was saying. There's a bigger conversation to be had about that. And I feel like one of the key things in the discussion about retirement is the deeper and more spiritual discussion about legacy. What are we leaving behind for future generations? And a lot of people who have financial wealth or wealth in terms of land think that they're providing security to their children in some way. Like, oh, I'm going to give my house to my kids when I pass away or something like that. Or my retirement money, the money that's in my bank account will go to them. But it doesn't do you any good if the global financial system collapses. And it doesn't do any good if the global banking system collapses, or if the global environmental monitoring system collapses, or all the things that are currently in various forms of collapse. And so what's interesting is to notice the difference between what we actually have that's valuable and our current inability to value it. That's something that Penny and I saw as we traveled for 2 years. We were doing bioregional activations, was everywhere we went, we met people who had land, who were stewards and caretakers of land, who did not have a transition plan to pass the land to a younger generation. If they had kids, their kids weren't really interested in it. And they're like, I've been growing a forest for 40 years, but who do I pass it to that'll keep maintaining the forest? And we found that what was valued but missing was a trusted linkage to a younger generation that would responsibly carry forward the mission. Basically, there wasn't a social mechanism of discovering who those people were. So we kept meeting people in their 70s with land, with very valuable land that they would give without needing any money to someone who would just keep caring for it, if they could trust those people to care for it. So what's interesting is how surprising what people value actually is. So in this case, what people value is the confidence that their purpose is carried forward by the next generation, maintained through a pattern of trust. And by discovering that, you start to see a kind of financial model. You're like, oh, there's a value flow there that could be understood. And the emphasis is playing matchmaker between younger people and older people around land transition. And you may not even have to pay any money to buy the land. The land might go into a land trust or into some other model. And so just recognizing that a lot of people don't know how to give what they have in terms of legacy. And then just to quickly answer your first question, all of the money that's come to us so far has come through private foundations and personal donations. So we've done crowdfunding with people giving $5 up to $100 and raising $50,000 in aggregate, to receiving a $200,000 grant from a private foundation, and various things in between. Large individual donors as well, like someone who gives $50,000 or $75,000. This is how we've moved all of the money up to this point in this system. And it's been pretty powerful because it's been based in trust and personal relationships. And so I think there's still a very strong leaning in that direction. And then about the idea of large scale diverse fundraising, that whole world is completely captured by an NGO space with huge intermediaries that pull most of the money to what are basically job creation programs for middle class employment in cities, with very little of the money actually getting to on the ground work. It's a whole conversation we could have around the way NGOs are structured and the problems with them. But just to say that that's very much in the Bill Sharp language of 3 horizons, very much horizon 2, meaning it still maintains the old system. And we need really different models. And because the social media algorithms have been so distorted by intentional manipulation, mass mobilization is effectively impossible now. It gets stopped by proactive search algorithms into those spaces by very wealthy people with huge search tools, where they're investing hundreds of billions of dollars to be sure something like Arab Spring can't happen again. And so they learned their lessons from Occupy Wall Street, and they bought up all the technology infrastructure and privatized it. And now they're doing data mining with tools that we can't even imagine the power of, to be sure we can't do mass mobilizations. So that's where that surveillance state part is disturbing, to put it lightly, but very, very important. So part of our reality check. But I hope that's helpful, Stephen, painting a realistic picture of the context. And then Kyle, over to you. So that we're
Thank you. Thanks, Joe. Thank you, Joe, for everything you do. Thank you for that presentation, and thank you for your whole team. And I appreciated everyone's comments and questions. By way of introduction, I'm currently in Newport, Rhode Island, but I live in Costa Rica, and I'm involved with a initiative there for the Brunca Diamante bioregion. It stretches from the highest mountain in Costa Rica, over 12,000 feet, all the way down to the Osa Peninsula, a great, extraordinary biodiversity hotspot. There's a lot of work being done by a number of organizations that I hope to meet all those organizations and in a process of, and follow the model you've laid out, Joe, for doing that in that bioregion. So I come to this with a background as a sailor, someone who has spent a lot of time on the ocean. I've sailed over 40,000 miles on 2 oceans plus the Caribbean. And so the piece that I brought to the table, part of it is the vision of uniting or bringing together, I guess, what could be called ocean bioregions or coastal bioregions with your terrestrial or riverine focus. And so there's an understanding that the fate of the oceans as a food source for all of us and as a healthy ecosystem is tied to the fate of the rivers. So the fishermen and the fisheries won't survive unless we change what's happening in the watershed and what's being introduced into the rivers in terms of forever chemicals, pesticides, industrial fertilizers, and so on. So I'm thrilled to say that this vision, this framing has been embraced by the organizers. And so that's just a brief introduction. I'm also working on some ideas around a regenerative operating system that I call RIOS, which in Spanish spelled R-I-O-S, not R-E-O-S. Is rivers. So it's something that is aligned phonetically and meaningfully to this work of bringing ocean and rivers together. So it's like many rivers, one ocean. We're all connected through the one ocean. There are many rivers and ways that we can impact that ocean. I would like to say that, respond to Eric's comment about the story, the narrative that is got to be something that we like have an event around, or a workshop, and just brainstorm, put it on the table. What story are we telling? What are some inspiring stories that we can tell? Like at a meta level, meta narrative type things, and suggest that maybe like the one that I've glommed onto or embraced is the idea of the Great Regeneration. And that's not something I can claim creating. It was actually John Elkington who put that in a post on X a few years ago, and I saw it. And then the Great Regeneration, phonetically, you bring it down, it's TGR, tiger. And there's a lot you can do about revealing your stripes, showing your stripes, and in terms of building a narrative and engaging people with a simple term that has a very deep meaning. So I just think that I just hope, and I'm sure we'll see some more focus on narrative building, meta narratives that will hopefully catch on in a big way and go viral, and lots of people. So will be joining us. And then in terms of what Claire put in one of her comments about diplomacy, and I'll try to wrap this up. I had a question for you, Joe. It's like, how do we go about separating the wheat from the chaff, or separating the adults from the children? What kind of process? I mean, yes, it's like happenstance. Okay, you get an introduction, you just wing it. You go out and say, okay, this is what we're working on. And you have to have your antenna up and feel whether they're engaging you on an ego level or whether they really get it. But
I would say, related to that one, Kyle, because this is something we actually have a lot of experience with, is and we have a lot of experience in the context of Colombia, where we have gotten to participate in very difficult conflicts and navigate them. And in navigating them, we see who stays in relationship, who's able to stay in relationship when things get hard. So just as one example, when we created our territorial foundation, Barichara Regenerativa, we had two key moments where there was a major conflict and about half the team left. So it's happened 2 different times. And each time some people stayed. And the people who stayed in the conflict, navigated it, engaged in indigenous social practices like listening circles and other things that are Northern Andes social technologies, and deepened their relationships and built trust. And so we've experienced the people who stay in relationship. And so I have a recent example of someone who showed up claiming to want to help us with fundraising, but even with the smallest tension with me, the person just disappeared. They're like, I'm not sticking around for this. Like, if you're not devoted to just having a conversation where there's a difference of opinion, then we're not going anywhere, because I guarantee things are going to be hard in the future. I guarantee there's going to be conflict, not every person with every person, but there's guaranteed to be conflict. We're doing hard stuff. And so the ability to stay in relationship, because the purpose is the thing that brought us together. The purpose is not, do I feel comfortable? The purpose is not, do we all feel happy? The purpose is not some shallower thing, but something like, the purpose is to be sure that the children of our community get the education they need. I have a specific person here in Barichara named Felipe that I talk about a lot in my other presentations. Felipe and I have been through multiple conflicts with each other, and now we're working really deeply together. And the last big conflict we had, we agreed that the most important thing was we each have children and we're both doing regenerative education work in our community. We both live in Barichara. And I just said, and we agreed, not just I, we agreed that we would put our personal differences aside because we're doing it for the kids, not for us. And that's just a sign of maturity, and what I see is there are a lot of people who walk around in adult bodies who don't have that kind of maturity about relationships, where they know that, you put your personal differences aside when they're not serving the shared purpose. And there's a level of maturity in that. And so that's one concrete example of the kind of capacity. There are others about truth and whether truth is actually important, because I've seen plenty of people who care more about perception than reality. about whether their reputation looks good or other things like that. Notice that I started off my talk today potentially discrediting my reputation, because I'm an Ozarks boy from Missouri, and I would rather be honest than be seen for something I'm not. And I've actually found that's been one of my secret superpowers. I turn off a lot of people, but I turn off all the wrong people. So I'm fine with turning them off. And I just learned that in practice. And so there's something about whether we're acting in service to truth or whether we're acting in service to image. And so there are various things like this that we could go further and further into, but they're all related to the changes in narrative. And so that's another whole topic that we can explore. But I see a big line of hands, so I'm going to stop now and pass it to the next person and pass it over to Claire.
Yeah, no, just also want to just acknowledge like the amazing vision and inspiration that you have brought, Joe, and in sharing the story. And I kind of wanted to speak to that also, just to say, totally agree about the messiness of community, but I realize in North America, it always shocks me just how little experience most people that we're engaging with have of effective community, and so don't know how to handle some of that messiness, and we need to relearn that. So just but I kind of want to bring in what we're doing in Regenerate Cascadia, because we've had to take a different approach. It's a different culture. We've got different styles of how we're doing this, and yet there's a learning from each other that is so valuable. And I kind of always invite in someone to push back on what I'm saying, because I tend to see the potential that's arising, and that can be it can be very exciting. But I don't feel as if I'm in La La Land either. So anyway, but I invite the pushback. But what is coming together in the Salish Sea, in Cascadia, but the Salish Sea especially, where we've got the most incredible confluence of people who've been doing stuff for a long time. The dots just haven't fully connected. And what I see is sort of almost leveraging the unfairness of the fact that the global north has had more resources, more attention, seems to kind of somehow get the focus in a way that, so just kind of acknowledging that, but realizing that maybe there's some things that might be coming together here that might actually be able to catalyze some of the funding with the storytelling that needs to happen, that then can bootstrap the other projects that are brilliantly doing what they're doing, deserve the funding. But there's a way of it bootstrapping each other. And so what I saw happening with at the BioFi conference, the amount of attention that we did have from people involved in finance, very excited that there is a vision of some of this coming together. Also want to just name something that may not be clear because we haven't even communicated it really. So we've got quite a designed pilot project that comes through Regenerate Cascadia. But we're also realizing there's emergent stuff everywhere, and there's a need to have this dual track. Benjamin Life of Open Civics was writing about that, so that using digital technology to hold even what Regenerate Cascadia can't, but that we're starting to bring in those stories so that we can see each other and coordinate better. So and all related to that is also the developing of a diplomacy network. And so we've got a big event that's coming up here in a couple of, actually about 10 days. It's called the Victoria Forum, and people like the ability to start sort of noticing how many like key voices are going to be there. And just to kind of name some of the people, but that are actually actively in conversation about this. Vanessa Andreotti will be speaking. Nate Hagen's going to be there. There's a whole whack of people. But just to have Thomas Homer Dixon from the Cascade Institute. So when we start talking about diplomacy and bringing in the storytelling to like the decision makers there's a desire to sort of focus on Cascadia right now as an example of bioregionalism. So talking to those decision makers, but using the partners that we have to do that. I feel like there's things that can happen here that can then have an impact elsewhere. And that was my main point, was just to kind of give a tiny window into, I know that we've got a wealth of stuff that's been going on here. And maybe one last thing is the deep work that people have been doing for decades and the case studies that have not had the light of day other than to a few people who know about it. So just amplifying that is important. So yeah.
Yeah, thank you, Claire. And I'll just mention that in that initial round of funding that the design school allocated last year, 25,000 of it went to Regenerate Cascadia to help them with this process. And in reciprocity, they wrote a beautiful article about what they're doing that we published on the Bioregional Earth website. So this way of financial flows leading to stories, which is exemplified in the Regenerate Cascadia project, in addition to everything else that Claire just said. Thank you for all of that, Claire. And then Howard, over to you. Oh, there you are.
When I saw Claire's hand, I wanted to follow and ask some specific questions about ways to apply flow funding to the Salish Sea and particularly the Colchian bioregion context, that what you're doing in the Northern Andes seems grounded in the culture. And I think the models we adopt and adapt here are going to have some different institutional founding. And I wanted to see from your experience when you used to live in this part of the world, how you regard, and I'm thinking about the strategy for Colchian Carbon Trust for us to get involved in flow funding. We're connected with our community foundations, particularly in Watkin, but also intending to connect with surrounding counties. We're also working with the Regen Network and very excited about eco credits as a way to create currency and flow that will trade money for the value of the ecosystem services and the good work that goes into regeneration. And also thinking that if we can be through flow funding connected with some types of labor exchanges to have that as part of the reciprocity. We've organized recently around three pillars of regeneration, resilience, and reciprocity as the way we've recast our board committees. And reciprocity is such a key to the regeneration succeeding, from everything you've said in your talks and just based on intuitive understanding. So I'd be interested in your reaction to those methods of community foundations, eco credits, tying it to labor exchanges, and maybe looking to the institutional frameworks that are existing in the more progressive space here, the co-ops, be they workers co-ops, producers co-ops, consumer co-ops, to somehow tie that in. That's a later stage. But again, I'm just trying to think how your experience there can be modified for the institutions and the culture that we have here.
Thanks, Howard. This is a really good discussion because it reveals something very specific that is important for the design based in your context. Because in your context, you need to know the legal frameworks, the financial reporting frameworks, the tax frameworks. Those kinds of things are going to be different. So like, how much money can someone give as a direct gift without having to pay taxes or without creating a tax burden for the recipient? That is IRS code. So that would have a US basis. It might be different from what the Washington state basis would be. So just recognizing you have those parallel jurisdictions. And also one of the things that's quite well developed within the North American context in both the US and Canada is the creation of donor advised funds. And actually one of the main ways that community foundations are captured is that donors still decide where they want to spend the money, regardless of what the community foundation discovers through some community research. So you end up with a lot of community foundations are limited by not having flexible budgets. Basically, the donors, I'll use the example that I'm really familiar with is the Toronto Foundation, the Toronto Community Foundation, where of the $31 million they gave out last year, 29 million of it was donors giving directly to whatever they wanted. So that means that, 95% of the money was the donors decide, not the collective intelligence of the community. And just recognizing that the key thing that foundation needed to work on was donor education and recruiting different kinds of donors and creating a different kind of donor advised fund. So this is the kind of thing that you would want to think about in your context, is with your local community foundations, how could you help them to culturally restructure? Like, how could you help them to identify donor groups that would work together as a different kind of donor advised fund, which is something they'd be very familiar with how to do, right? So I think that kind of difference is really important. To say in your context, you have people who are experts in the kinds of institutions they have, but then you need to hack them culturally, which is to use those institutional structures in a different way. Like use the donor advised fund, but with a different cultural context of what it means, as just as an example. So I would say that's a really powerful edge that you can go into, because you're going to have a lot of people who are probably very frustrated with the institutions they work in. They're more radical than their own institutions. I mean, you live in Cascadia. You have lots of really radical people with less radical institutional environments. So if they can have good ways to be a little bit more radical or to be more agile in how they're creative, I think that'll be really powerful. And that relates to the Web3 crypto world, because the culture of money in the Web3 world is different. There are a lot of people who still play with it as though it's play money, but I mean in the positive sense, that they're not as psychologically encumbered. When I went into the Web3 space, it was because those are the people willing to give me money. If someone would give me cryptocurrency, I'd be happy to convert it to Colombian pesos to give to a campesino in Barichara. But the crypto money moved more easily than fiat money because the cultures around money are really different. And so I think that the tools themselves, as you're already discovering, are quite powerful. But even more powerful is the institutional cultures of the Web3 world, where people just think about and flow money in really different ways. And that's probably the bigger strength of it at this point in time, even though there are a lot of great tools out there. And so like, I'll give an example of people setting up a tool, but the tool was wrong, but they didn't know that, is the use of DAOs, decentralized autonomous organizations, with a voting structure that requires 3 votes for money to be released. Well, I was just part of a really big experiment with this project called Nouns, where they wanted to allocate money, but they needed members of their DAO to vote to sponsor a project, or by its own rules, the smart contracts couldn't be met. And what happened was they couldn't allocate any money because their own members weren't participating in the voting. So they created what seemed like a beautiful conceptual model of governance that completely didn't work. And now all the money is locked within their DAO. They can't even access because their own members aren't participating. So this is why when people create abstract governing structures based on a tool, rather than real world governance and then deciding the tools to use, completely different thing. And these are all good people whose goal was to get money to flow faster. But then they got busy and just stopped paying attention to all of the proposals coming in. And all they needed to do was sponsor them to vote. And these were for $10,000 micro grants. And so, so I got to participate in that a few months ago of, wow, it's so easy to get $10,000 to move to a regenerative project, but you have to have members of the DAO who are verified voters to be able to vote. You needed 3 sponsors to get it approved. And they just weren't participating in voting in their own DAO. So just as an example of, it's the culture, not the tool, even though the tools could be really powerful. So but the money moves differently there. So, interesting.
Just want Well, but just before I leave the stage on this question, what do you think about linking flow funding and labor pooling? Is there synergies, or is the tax and the rules of the road and labor going to make that impossible? But work sharing along with money sharing would seem to have tremendous synergies in allowing reciprocity for people who don't have wealth.
I mean, the key design element of flow funding is a trust-based relationship with local knowledge. So there are various other elements, but the key piece is I'm a flow funder. I can flow funding to someone else because there's trust between us and there's knowledge of local content, that this is a good place to flow the money. And so, and then from there you get into the details of each context. But with that understanding, the shared understanding of the context reveals multi-capital potential. Like you're saying about labor, there are various kinds of capital in that context, and it's the trust that creates the flow. So the flow of money and the allocation of money in the financial part is, of course, you can do that with the other kinds of value in that context as well. And so I would say the key element of flow funding that's important is the strengthening of the social capital, the relationships of shared context and trust. And then in that context, develop all kinds of flow models. And so it's completely compatible, is the other way of saying it. It's completely compatible.
I'm glad we named ourselves Trust. I'm not sure about carbon, but I'm sure about that.
Yeah, trust is critical. So thanks, Howard. And Joshua, how you doing? Over to you.
Hey, good to be here. No, it's been a little bit. Oh, I really like the focus that Kyle brought into the conversation around narrative building, and it's been on my mind quite a bit on how we could collectively build towards those narratives, and even using multiple capital flows and governance that allows for all stakeholders to be valued. How can we build media alliances on this, where you can get capital? That's how we really try to we fund the narrative, and it's governed by, if you think at Got Milk in the US, what was that campaign around? It was around the dairy industry, but the dairy industry, the people that were largely governing it was the big corporations that were running dairy, and it was subsidized by the government as well, which makes me believe narrative and building those media campaigns out. If we were to do something like that, if we could create a Got Milk for bioregionalism or the Got Milk for regeneration, what are the ways that we could actually have shared governance on the narrative itself, so it's not run by the big corporations at hand, or it's not being money's not being taken from government into those, and it's not corrupt and extractive and exploitative in that nature. So I think there's also these tools that we're building for the bioregionalism could also be used for building out media campaigns. Something that we're exploring within the regenerative business economics ecosystem, RegenB, and trying to build out shared governance or a shared resource pooling. I know you've talked to probably Graham Boyd of Evolute 6 and understand the Fair Shares Commons model. I'm wondering if this is interesting to you and to others in the room. How can we build a Fair Shares Commons, a closed commons container that allows us to pool and gather the resources and pretty much protect and enable things that could be held in commons for everybody, like the media, like the narrative. The narrative should be held in commons. We should be able to murmurate between bioregionalism, and then go into the watersheds, and then be able to use those same resources. So I'm still playing around with the idea. We're still having conversations around it in the RegenB, but I would love to get your thoughts and others in the space as well on how we can collectively build the narratives together.
Thanks, Joshua. I think this is really an important opportunity because the pooling of narrative resources is a big deal. And actually a significant part of the budget that we're raising money for in Barichara is we created a media and communications team that I just paid for out of my pocket. And now we don't have the money to keep them going. And what they're doing is building narrative commons in Barichara, and it's extremely valuable. What I wanted to comment on is a key part of our discussion last week in the Northern Andes Fund, where we had this meeting for 3 days in Medellin, was we talked about the role of intermediaries in the world of international cooperation, where basically like it's pretty typical that at most 1 or 2% of international development money gets to local communities. Basically, almost none of it. Almost all of the money goes to intermediaries. And so we talked a lot about what is a legitimate intermediary. Because here we are creating the Northern Andes Fund and territorial foundations, and they are intermediaries. How do we have legitimacy? And one of the key elements of legitimacy is around narrative. And so part of what we decided in the fund last week was the percentage of allocation of the funds we have. We wanted to be sure that at minimum 50% of the money would go to on-the-ground impact in the first year. Now, it can't be more than that because we need to invest in some infrastructure. We're early days, but we didn't want 80% to go to infrastructure and 20% to go to on-the-ground impact. So we were like, part of being the structuring of the narrative is actually guaranteeing a percentage, a minimum percentage is going to the purpose in a sense of it's actually reaching the ground. And then the other key thing was about half of the 3 days of meetings were actually about my relationship to the fund and how the fund is related to the Earth Regeneration Fund and the design school. Because the territorial foundations of Colombia know almost nothing about what I do outside of Barichara. You know, I do it in English language. They don't know what I do. So I had to spend a lot of time explaining it and us coming to clarity about how I could be a legitimate representative of their narratives. Because I'm going to go out in the world and tell the stories of Putumayo, tell the stories of Medellin. How can I have legitimacy? And so the way that we agreed that we would create the integrity of the legitimacy was in that local processes mapped to portfolios, to narrative strategies developed by the territories themselves that then are elevated as legitimate narratives to tell. So my job is to help the local territorial foundation to construct a legitimate narrative that their local processes see as legitimate. So that at every level of exchange, the narrative is seen as legitimate among the intermediaries. So that I could go out and talk to a potential investor in Canada or in Europe, and there would be legitimacy all the way to a small regenerative project and a watershed in Colombia. And so the narrative alignment is where we're holding that. And so that's a really key place where you can see the narrative commons comes in the construction of narratives as a participatory process from the ground up. So the local processes structuring narratives, obviously a lot of local processes don't know how to create narratives. So there's a need for help in doing that. There's a need for having support in structuring it. And that's where I have a lot of expertise in narratives and narrative strategies, so I can directly help with that. But there are others who can too. But the key is that the narrative structuring is how we build that intermediary. And that is like front and center. It's a core piece of, here's a portfolio of regenerative education projects in each of the 7 territories, and they are adequately represented to a Northern Andes education agenda. That then can go to a funder and create legitimate alignment with financial flow. And so you see how it's built in every step and every level. There's much more to say on that, but you can see it's a core piece. So definitely we could talk more about how we could build these media campaigns. Like definitely.
Yes, let's do it. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Joshua. And then Eric, over to you. Oh, you're muted. There you go. No, yeah, you're muted. We can't hear you.
How about that?
Perfect.
What I omitted from my previous comment was that, and tying into having a cohesive narrative strategy, as you just explained, is that changing value of how value is perceived is actually a spiritual journey. It's not a logical journey. So changing money, the perception of money and how we use and how we apply it and the rules of money is, in the end, a spiritual journey, which means how do we distinguish between the intertwining of negative energy and living energy. And within our world today, there is on balance of probability, there is more negative energy present than there is living positive energy present. So it's a journey of distinguishing and being recognizing, being able to recognize different levels of energy, which has nothing to do really with how we tell stories in a semi-mechanical sense today, So it's a whole long conversation for another day, but I just wanted to add that to the conversation.
Well, thank you,
Thank
Eric.
you.
And I noticed that Steve put his hand up a couple times and went down. I just want to ask Steve if he wants to speak, to make space if he would. And I'll give a very real phenomenon that happens with me that's related to what you said, Eric, which is, for those of you who have been around me in person, I have a contagious energy, and that people tend to really like my energy as long as I'm not in a weird, funky mood. And something that happens, and I just had someone comment on it yesterday, the local gelato shop where this couple in Barichara created a gelato shop. And they were commenting that every time I come in there, for some reason that they can't explain energetically, other people just start coming in and they get more customers. And there's another place in Barichara called Chevre that the same thing happens. Like, uh-oh, Joe just showed up. Get ready, we're about to be busy. A bunch of customers are coming in. And there's something energetic about being an attractor to a space. Now, I don't stand at the entrance to the gelato shop and go, wow, look at this great gelato. All I do is I just be an enthusiastic, childlike energy, enjoying a gelato, having fun chit-chatting with whoever I'm with there. And whatever it is about that creates an energetic field. And so this is not logical. It is measurable, but not with our reductionistic measures. And there's an energetic pull. And the reminder for me when the person told me this yesterday was that part of my spiritual practice is to just let that innocence come out more often. And the best way I know how to do that is to hang out with my 8-year-old daughter, because she inherited some of my energy. She's a lot like me, but she's 8. So she's like so innocent that she doesn't know how to not be innocent. She's going to come to that place with, like, sometimes called crossing the Rubicon, around 9 years old, where she's going to start to enter into the darkness of pre-adolescence, the crises of reality that happen that we've all been through as adults. She's about to enter that. But right now, just hanging out with my daughter, she is totally that. And so there's something about the energy field in what you're describing that it's measurable, and that the woman who has the gelato shop notices that for some reason I come into her shop and other people I don't know, there's a correspondence in time, but it's an energetic field pattern, and it's very much in the realm of spirituality. So I just want to name that, Eric, as an example of what you're talking about.
It's called attractor fields.
Yeah, and it's very real. So
absolutely.
Yeah. So thank you, Eric, for that. And Steve, I just want to ask, I know that we're over time, but you'd raised your hand a couple of times. So I just want to offer you space. I know you're very polite when we're near time, but I just thought I'd ask in case you wanted to.
Yeah, thanks, Joe. No, there were so many people that wanted to talk, and I'd already had a chance. So I decided to move to the bottom of the queue. But then the conversation went into this, the importance of narratives and getting them out there. And so I did want to mention, I put a comment in the chat that I am connected with a group that is actively creating a conscious media ecosystem and a media commons. And the idea is to bring high-level production capacity and large-scale distribution channels to what they're calling conscious media, and they've expressed an interest to me to make sure to tell you that they're very interested in carrying the authentic regenerative stories to a large-scale audience. Now, they're very early days, and so I don't want to over inflate the expectations here, but I did want to plant that seed, and yeah.
Well, thank you, Steve. And whenever they're ready, just have them reach out or put us in touch.
Okay.
Thank you.
And Sage, I noticed your interest as well.
And then Carlos has his hand up, which had his hand up earlier as well. Carlos.
Thank you, Joe. And I'm sorry, I'm off camera. I'm with my son and my dog outside. I have a short question. It's just, what are your thoughts on the timeline for a lot of these effects to come in?
Well, this is one of those questions that's really interesting to explore in detail. And I'll just share that one of the things I'm starting in October, and I've already posted one announcement about it in the design school, is that I actually started writing a manuscript of a book 3 years ago. And I went back and picked it up again. I was like, wow, I still like this. I think I feel like writing again. And it's called When Earth Speaks. And one of the things I want to do in the writing in that manuscript is I want to explore the tipping points of the Earth system and their regenerative inverses. Like, not just what's scary about what's happening in Siberia with the permafrost and the release of methane, but what is the underlying regenerative pattern of the Earth that we need to restore to stabilize that pattern? And how does this breakdown, this creation of systemic risk, how does it reveal a pathway to systemic resilience? And back to Kyle's comment earlier about the oceans and the rivers being connected, a major river system is the atmospheric rivers, which are largely driven by the jet streams, which are profoundly shaped by the El Nino and La Nina, which are sea surface temperature anomalies over the Pacific, which shape the precipitation patterns of the Americas. So basically, the ocean and continental patterns are profoundly connected through an Earth systems process. And so what I want to do is explore in more detail what is actually known about these tipping points. But rather than talking about the tipping points as really scary things that we're afraid are going to happen, first of all, they're mostly already happening. So sorry, if you're afraid they're going to happen, you got to deal with that. But then the second thing is, what do they reveal about systemic resilience? Because where we're going if humans don't go extinct, and this is one of the meta narratives, this is the Anishinaabe prophecy of the eighth fire, which is choosing of the green path instead of choosing the charred path, is how do we go back and recollect all of the best knowledge of modernity and all of the best knowledge of our ancestral wisdom traditions and integrate them into planetary consciousness, which is what we have to do if we're going to survive what's happening now. So really going deep into the details of the Earth systems part, I feel like that's one of my personal contributions to make. I'm very highly trained in Earth system science, and very few people who are highly trained in Earth system science have the spiritual appreciation of indigenous worldviews that I have. They're more like academic scientists. They're good people, but they just don't have that awareness, most of them. You know, there are very few Robin Wall Kimmerers who are both trained scientists and indigenous. There are very few of those. And so we need more of this blending. And I think exploring the tipping points of the Earth as a spiritual practice and as a window into regenerative design is really important. So I would say it in that way. And if we were to talk about the timelines now as you're walking around with your children, that would probably stress you out, because it's pretty scary what the prognostication, the forecasts are pretty scary, is what I would say. I would say they might shut down your parasympathetic system if you heard them too much all at once. So what we have to do is be able to sit with them, you know, go into attend some inner space sessions with Penny to help us to do that. Or some of the other amazing healing practices that are out there. For now, I noticed that we're 10 minutes over our scheduled time. And I want to name something that I did, my inner trickster, you know, my coyote archetype. Back to what Steve brought up in his first question. Why did I share this vision and say it's probably not going to happen? It's because I think the only way it'll happen, this is my forecast now, the only way it'll happen is if enough of us believe it has to happen, even if we don't know if it can happen. And I think that is a requirement for the narrative strategy. And I intentionally put it into my storytelling because only those who believe it must happen will do the hard work of making it happen. It's not because it's a shiny thing. It's not because it's an easy sell. It's because it's what we must do and we're devoted. And that's part of the reason that I, took the air out of my own balloon from the very beginning of the story today, because I deeply believe this is the only way to go. Deeply, deeply believe it. And I deeply believe it is not going to happen unless, back to reading the book, The Lorax, unless someone like you cares a whole awful lot. By the way, I've read The Lorax like 300 times to my daughter, so I've got it completely memorized. Unless someone like you cares a whole awful lot is one of the lines at the end of The Lorax, when the Onceler gives the seed to the child. And it's the last truffula tree. It's the last truffula seed. So we have the seed. And after seeing my presentation today or participating in the design school, we know what we need to do. The question is, are we going to do it? And it's not up to me to do. It's up to us to do. And that's why we have to believe it's necessary together with the funders. They have to believe it's necessary. Any other sales pitch is not going to do it. If they want me to be shiny and pretty and politically correct, if they require that, if that image is more important than whether this is the right thing to do, see, it's like we have to believe it at that level of depth. And so that's where my Ozarks pragmatism comes out. Call it like it is. And I would say our chances are pretty slim, but I can't say if they're zero. I'm not omniscient. No one is. But if we're going to do it, it's going to be at that level of depth. And so we saw it today. I'm going to make this webinar public. You can share it with anyone who you think might help make this happen. And this is the message. And you can even give them the message with this level of sobriety. Get ready. Joe's going to say something right at the beginning that might turn you off, but keep listening. Because it's not about me. I'm a good salesman, but I'm refusing to be one. I refuse. I refuse to be a salesman in a time like this. And so I want the people who are serious. And I want to turn everyone else off. Because only the people who are committed to seeing this through, we need funding for like 20 years. We need funders that are not going to give us money tomorrow and walk away. We need people who are with our children when they're adults, still helping them to do this. Some of us on this call may not have had our children yet, who will be adults when we're doing this. So that's what I see is the level of devotion to this work. And so thank you so much for being here to participate, to witness, to contribute. And if it's going to happen, it's not going to be because of me. I'm doing my part, but I just want to make that really clear that we do it. And so, but we're structuring it. We're preparing for it. We're channeling it. We're moving the resources continuously, and we're not going to stop. Those of you who know me know I'm not going to stop. So, so thank you very much for this wonderful conversation, and looking forward to more. So take care, everyone.